forced to abandon their ancestral homelands in the southeastern United States and relocate to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma.
As the United States sought to cleanse its lands of its true native people.
During the removal, countless died from exposure, disease, and starvation. Their unnecessary deaths are now seen as a near genocidal event.
People at the time knew it was wrong. People at the time knew it was illegal. People at the time knew it was unconstitutional. And it happened anyway.
Now go!
So, the subject of the Indian Removal Act, the American policy of Indian removal, and the subsequent event colloquially referred to as the Trail of Tears, is a popular matter of discussion among left-wing and anti-white demagogues. It's the closest thing they can find in American history to a deliberate policy of ethnic cleansing coming from the government of the United States. These people hate the United States and hate white people for myriad reasons, and latch on to any post hoc justification for such hatred they can find. Their claims, which have unfortunately become the public perception, stem from the concrete fact that the United States did indeed provide for the relocation of some 60,000 Native Americans from at least 18 tribes from their traditional homeland in the eastern United States to newly acquired land west of the Mississippi River. Now, this is where any basis in fact, in reality, stops, and the politically motivated historical revision begins on their part. Now, I understand the left isn't a monolith, right? Even the bread tubers. But for the sake of time and my own sanity, I'm going to address their claims collectively, not individually. I don't have the time to sit here all day and debunk every bread tuber on the internet. If you think I'm attempting to straw man my opponents, well, just go tune in to any bad empanada or vow stream and listen to what they have to say. I mean, you saw the intro.
So folks, today I just wanted to talk about crackers, specifically white crackers, and how I f***ing hate inferior, disgusting white crackers.
These anti-white shit-lib progressive types will go on to claim that white Americans, for the desire of the natural resources on the land that the Indians possessed, agitated for something to be done with the Indians who resided there so that white Americans could have the land. That, and white people just had this irrational racial hatred for Indians, born out of nothing but prejudice, and didn't want them around anymore. The President and Congress of the United States, being ever reflexive to the needs of white people and white people alone, passed a law that allowed them to get their way. The army was mobilized and showed up at Indian encampments without warning. These noble savages were then ripped out of their homes in the dead of night, given little or no time at all to prepare, and marched at bayonet point, against their will, across the country, all while being brutalized and savaged by white people. They were then dumped onto useless land they knew nothing about and were doomed to poverty for all eternity. And if they don't directly make these claims, they heavily imply that this is the case, and this has certainly gone on to become the public perception of the event. If these anti-white types make any mention at all of the treaties the Indian tribes made with the United States government, they make the claim that they were coerced into signing them, or the United States government negotiated with those who did not have the authority to treat with the US government, and therefore those treaties are invalid. To further substantiate their claims, they love to provide first-hand accounts of the lived experience of the event, right? They love to cite some random letter out of context from someone close to the incident about how they thought Indian removal wasn't very nice or something.
So what do you think about when you think whites?
They're mean to us so much.
Or they'll cite the politically motivated ramblings of leftist academics, usually out of context and behind a paywall as well, in order to substantiate their claims. For example, they love to talk about Davy Crockett and his role in the passage of the Indian Removal Act.
Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier.
But I digress. So, even if this perception is incorrect, right? What's the danger? Why is this a problem? It's just some event from like 200 years ago with seemingly little bearing on the present, and furthermore, we have other stuff to worry about. The country's currently imploding. Why do you want to talk about Indian removal? Well, Here's why this stuff matters. This is one of the major events, the cardinal sin many use to both impugn the moral character of white people as a whole and delegitimize the old, i.e. white government of the United States. The idea that the Indians were brutalized and their land was unjustly seized is used to justify modern-day action against whites and political policy that ignores the original intent of the founders, our borders, and our national sovereignty. In a broader context, this is also used to dehumanize and demonize white people, things you need to do to a people if you intend to do terrible things to them, though that's a discussion for another time.
Kill the white man. Kill him until he is dead.
See, most people are not academics or critical thinkers. Most people know little and care less about history. And even those who have the ability to critically analyze historical events and come to their own conclusions that aren't fed to them by left-wing academics, many simply lack the interest or proclivity towards history.
Fuck books. Books are for pussies.
No.
Go hit the gym.
No.
And I don't say this in a glib attempt to deride or denigrate people. In fact, my own position on this is that most people are too concerned with their own immediate material condition to be worried about the veracity of historical claims and their political implications. The overwhelming majority of people just don't question authority figures like teachers and academics, even if they are interested in such things.
And you will respect my authority.
The public at large is generally going to walk away from their primary education with this vague notion that white people were very mean to Indians and perpetrated a genocide or ethnic cleansing, with Indian removal, or as many understand it, the Trail of Tears being the key piece at the center of it all. History is such a soft science that the veracity or falsehood of certain claims like this aren't readily apparent, right? These aren't things that are easily empirically proved true or false, and public perception becomes the reality. And this perceived reality has become a core tenet of the leftist religion. White people internalize this perception and adopt the mentality that they must be punished and offer up some sort of penance to the god of cultural Marxism. They've got to genuflect at the altar of diversity to atone for the sins of their forefathers.
Happy Black History Month.
When I say slavery, you say sorry, slavery!
Non-whites internalize this and develop a sense of victimhood, which they then turn around and weaponize, using it as a casus belli for the subversion and conquest of white countries.
You're a victim.
Here we go, CSI.
Though most really don't give it a ton of thought, the impact of this deliberate and willful misinterpretation of this historical event is lifelong and widespread. And there's not many on the dissident right, or the right broadly, who's inclined to challenge these claims. And if they do, they usually do so in such a way that it's unproductive and it actually lends itself to the narratives that the shitlibs are trying to push. Right-wingers or conservatives will usually address this topic in one of two main ways. They'll either say something to the effect of, yeah, it's a shame about those Indians, but they were just kind of in the way of progress and they couldn't adapt. That's the way of the world. Or they'll say something to the effect of, yeah, based. This land was conquered, not stolen. We sure killed those Indians and took it for ourselves.
Was this story of vengeance in the forest based? Not this time.
Both of these are both historically inaccurate and feed into the narrative that whites are the perpetual aggressors. In reality, this land was purchased, civilized, and defended, not conquered in the traditional sense. We literally have the receipts, as we'll talk about later. Moreover, from a philosophical standpoint, this also implies that our moral code is nothing more than justice is the advantage of the stronger, as though we consider Thrasymachus to be a moral paragon. Our thought and philosophy is deeper than that. Furthermore, that's a two-way street that can be, and often is, just as easily used to justify our own conquest and our own demographic replacement. In adopting these particular defenses of American conduct, we're agreeing to the narrative that whites are uniquely evil and hell-bent on domination and subjugation of those who they consider to be inferiors, which couldn't be further from the truth, as evidenced by our actions, which we'll examine later in this video.
And what have they ever given us in return? The aqueduct?
Understand that the white people of the past are the genetic stock from which the white people of today come from. 1832, though outside of living memory, wasn't that long ago. Certainly not long enough ago with a different enough set of circumstances, culture, religion, etc., that our fundamental sense of morality and just conduct would have been changed dramatically when compared to the present day. Largely, our behaviors and sense of morality remain much the same as they were 200 years ago. If we in the present day would find something to be morally repugnant, then chances are people 200 years ago would have similar attitudes. If we are not monsters, you and I, we should treat claims that our recent forefathers were with healthy skepticism. As the adage goes, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. In order to come to that conclusion, and before we can really undertake what the policy of Indian removal was, we have to have a proper understanding of Indian relations with whites prior to 1832. It's important to contextualize this conversation with an overview of the legal status and standing of Indians and Indian tribes respectively. Many take for granted and don't consider that there was a time that members of Indian nations existed as something other than U.S. citizens. Most aren't really aware that Indians live in a legal quasi-independent state wherein they currently get to have their cake and eat it too. We'll dig into that more later, but for now, suffice to say that blanket citizenship was not forced upon Indian tribe members until the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. Yes, I said forced. It was made clear during the ratification debates for the 14th Amendment that birthright citizenship did not apply to Indians because they were subject to a foreign jurisdiction. And the idea that we would just grant blanket citizenship to anyone who happened to be born within the geographic boundaries of the United States was silly on its face.
Are you stupid or something?
Mind you, this lack of citizenship was largely born of the desire of the Indian tribes, who would be offered opportunities to gain U.S. citizenship starting with the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, which was signed by the Choctaw and ratified by the U.S. Congress in 1831. By and large, Indian nations opposed the idea of obtaining U.S. citizenship, with notable resistance to the aforementioned Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 and all the attendant goodies that would come along with being U.S. citizens. We allowed the Indian tribes to opt into or out of being a subject to the U.S. government, and the right to sovereignty and independence, rights we whites deny ourselves. Just look at all the blood we spilled settling that question in 1861. If the Indians are independent and sovereign, then they can and ought to be treated as any other foreign nation. We, the United States, retain full authority to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, and anything else a free and independent nation may of right do. Right or wrong, the way of the world is generally that the strong seize the land of the weak. Further, any reasonable nation would consider constant harassment and border skirmishing, with civilians being the primary target more often than not, to be more than they're willing to bear, and would begin conducting military operations to secure their frontier with an eye towards a permanent solution that would not bode well for the continued existence of their adversaries.
Don't mess with me, I'm one crazy mofo. I had to pop a cop because he wasn't giving me my props in Oaktown.
If the Indians are citizens, then they are subject to the concept of eminent domain, and, though entitled to the protections afforded to U.S. citizens, they are not entitled to treat with the government and try to negotiate. They can have their land seized in exchange for a payment at fair market value without any discussion. Instead of trying to neatly pigeonhole the Indians into one of these two categories, we, out of a sense of both justice and magnanimity, afforded the Indians a bizarre quasi-independent status that has no real historical or modern parallel outside of maybe Australia's Aboriginal reserves, wherein we treated them with kid gloves, as you'll come to see. The other issue with the Indian tribes bearing this quasi-sovereign status is an obvious one. Having nations within nations that are not true subjects to a higher level authority just creates issues in so many respects. The most notable and relevant issues in this respect culminated around the time of Indian removal in Georgia in 2 landmark Supreme Court cases. Now, without getting too far into the legal weeds, Worcester v. Georgia held that the state of Georgia lacked the legal authority to make laws regulating Indian nations and conduct on Indian territory. The reason being, the court held, is that Indian nations constitute just that, sovereign nations. As such, only the federal government had the power to treat with the Indian tribes. Similarly, the Cherokee Nation v. Georgia held that because all Indian nations, including the Cherokee Nation, were sovereign, the Supreme Court lacks the jurisdiction to make rulings on cases brought to the court by Indian nations. These 2 rulings, in conjunction, effectively carved any section of land controlled by Indians away from the states in which their territory was located and allowed them self-rule. This naturally chapped the collective asses of the southern states who were disproportionately impacted by these rulings, as seen on this map. Put yourself in their shoes for a moment. Within living memory, you rebelled against the British Empire for, primarily, reasons having to do with not wanting to be subject to foreign rule. Now, you find yourself having a handful of backward savages take significant chunks of your territory and prevent you from expanding and further civilizing it. Okay, now put yourself in the shoes of the federal government. You have several southern states who are beginning to become increasingly agitated with northerners in the federal government for myriad other reasons unrelated to this, who are very unhappy with these legal rulings with respect to the Indians. You also recently acquired a vast swath of sparsely inhabited and as of yet unorganized territories to the west, far removed from the lion's share of white citizens. Neither the whites nor the Indians are happy with the status quo. What do? What is the natural solution here staring you in the face? It goes almost without saying that any nation which genuinely cares for its populace has a vested interest in securing its borders from outside hostility and preventing any civil strife and violent conflict within its own borders. Again, there exists a public perception that the Indian tribes were of a peaceful disposition, wanting only to be left alone, and that they were the victims of constant white aggression.
I didn't do fucking shit. I didn't rig shit. I didn't fucking do this. I'm not worried about it. I'm not worried about any of this. This world's fucking so fucked up. I'm done. Do what you want. Pull the plug. I'll kill you.
While I'm not here to defend the actions of every white person who ever lived, and it's exceedingly unlikely that any group of people has behaved justly in every circumstance, right? I want to refute the lived experience, first-hand account, horror porn that is the tales of white atrocities and barbarity, with concrete examples of Indian aggression and savagery towards whites in particular. Savagery that far exceeded and surpassed any wrong done to them by whites. It's worth noting that this isn't an inclusive list, and to attempt to include such a list in this video would be impractical. This is just what I could find very easily up to 1832, when Indian removal started occurring in earnest. I found so much, in fact, that it got to the point where I would open up a link and hope that it was outside my time frame, so I didn't have to read more for the sake of my own time. Additionally, with respect to my sources, I'm going to be unapologetically linking Wikipedia articles. And I can already hear the comment section complaining right now about how unacademic that is to be linking Wikipedia sources, and to a degree you're right, just not in the way you think you are. It's a matter of public record that the people who edit these Wikipedia articles are like top-tier, shit-lib, tranny, white people haters.
MMI 628, communist, Desvele, communist, Visa, communist, David King. Now this guy's special. He was in pretty much every single article that I was looking at. He is a pansexual anarcho-communist.
So, I'm doing this in an attempt to Iron Man my own argument, right? Like, if it made it to a Wikipedia article, chances are the evidence that this event occurred is simply irrefutable, and furthermore, it's going to be framed in the most charitable light to the Indians. What I don't want to do is waste a bunch of my time and your time digging up a bunch of primary sources or older historical texts and have somebody debunk one singular event or debunk one author as an illegitimate hack and get bogged down in that debate as opposed to the meat and potatoes, so to speak, of what we're discussing here. And in any case, I'm a big believer that if you're submitting things to the public discourse like this, like what I'm doing right now, you need to restrict yourself to sources that are readily available and not behind a paywall, so everybody can take a look at what it is you're reading in context. Now, continuing on. Conflict with the Indians begins almost immediately after permanent settlement of the modern-day U.S. and continues really up into the 20th century. So galling were these attacks to our founders that it was one of the grievances that they had with King George III, who had, quote, endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions.
Savages! Drive them from our shore!
This seems to be no exaggeration. Let's examine some of the actions of the noble savage with an eye to determining whether or not we could have ever hoped to live in a peaceful state of cohabitation with the Indian nations. It's worth noting that being captured by Indians was no picnic. I don't want you to dismiss any accounts of people being taken captive as somehow not a bad thing or evidence of Indian mercy. As with everything, the exact experience varied from tribe to tribe and from occasion to occasion, but a white could expect one of a few things to happen to them if they should find themselves at the mercy of Indians. If they were lucky, they might simply be held until ransomed by whites. More likely than not, they were going to be beaten, tortured, raped, or otherwise mistreated. If they were unlucky, they might be enslaved and forcibly assimilated into the tribe, or, worst case scenario, ritually murdered in some horrible way, such as being flayed alive. In 1631, the Dutch established the Zwaanendael colony in what is now modern-day Delaware. This ill-fated colony did not last particularly long. There was a simple misunderstanding that, of course, naturally resulted in the Indians wiping out the entire colony, as one does when you have simple misunderstandings, right? As an aside, when I say I'm Iron Manning my arguments by looking at the Wikipedia pages, this is what I mean. Like, the Wikipedia editors here are poo-pooing away the massacre as the result of a simple misunderstanding.
There was a misinput. Calm down! You calm the fuck down! There was a misinput!
Oh my fucking god. The biohazard container.
God, this community is overreacting.
And how did the Indians go about doing this, right? Did they march in force against the colony? War banners fluttering in the breeze, trumpets sounding? No, they approached residents of the colony as they were working, pretending to be friends, and then murdered them. In 1689, in Dover, New Hampshire, the Pennacook Indians, who were upset with one Major Richard Waldron over the deceptive way in which he took 400 Native Americans captive during King Philip's War 13 years prior, decided to, as seems to be their MO, approach the white town members under the guise of friendship and actually ask them for permission to sleep by the fire in their garrison houses in order to keep warm, which apparently was not uncommon, and then took advantage of that kindness and chose to murder or capture 52 colonists, a full quarter of the entire population of Dover at the time. Again, in retaliation against one man for an event that took place 13 years prior, wherein nobody was murdered, unless you count the 7 or 8 that were convicted of insurrection and executed.
The guillotine has been out of fashion for us.
True, those who weren't killed were sold into slavery, which, is not a good thing. I'm not, nor have I ever defended the institution of slavery as a positive thing. But that was the historical norm, and the Indians are not innocent of the crime of slavery themselves. They practiced it too. There's a huge moral difference between capturing 400 enemy combatants, admittedly in a semi-deceptive manner, but there was a war on, and selling them into slavery, and then, 13 years later, deciding to go murder a bunch of innocent men, women, and children who had little or nothing to do with the event. In 1692, in the raid on York in the New England colonies, 200 to 300 natives killed about 100 of the English settlers who lived there and burned down all the buildings and took another 80 villagers captive. One Captain John Flood, who had come down with a militia from Portsmouth, found on his arrival that the greatest part of the whole town was burned and robbed, with nearly 50 killed and another 100 captured. He reported that he found one Reverend Dummer was barbarously murdered, stripped naked, cut, and mangled by those sons of Belial. In 1729, the Natchez tribe killed 138 men, 35 women, and 56 children at Fort Rosalie, in what was then the French territory of Louisiana. They then set fire to the fort, the store, and all the homesteads, burning them to the ground. In 1755, during the French and Indian Wars, Indians launched dozens of raids against British colonial settlements, killing and capturing hundreds, and putting entire communities such as Penn's Creek, Great Cove, Gnadenhutten, and many more both to the torch and to the sword. So many events are there that it would be foolish to try to enumerate them all here, but a particularly bloody example is the siege of Fort William Henry. Montcalm, the leader of the French army, ever worried about the behavior of his Indian allies, issued explicit orders that the surrendering British were not to be harmed or harassed in any fashion. The fact that Montcalm felt that such an order was needed gives real insight into the character of the Indian tribes, indicating that it was both in their nature and a real concern that they might perpetrate some sort of horrific atrocity on the surrendering British, civilians, women, and children included. Naturally, that order goes unheeded. The Indians, as they are wont to do, seized an opportunity to attack the weak and defenseless, killing between 200 and 1,500, depending on which estimates you believe. In 1764, the first school shooting on the American continent at the Enoch Brown School took place. 4 Delaware Indians, who a day prior had encountered a pregnant white woman on the road, beat her to death, scalped her, and cut the child out of her womb. Being unsatisfied with the simple murder of one unborn child and one woman, they then proceeded towards the Enoch Brown School, where they entered, killed the schoolmaster, and 10 other children besides, and scalped them. One additional child was scalped, but somehow he managed to live. By the time the American Revolution occurs, the story with the behavior of the Indians is much the same as it was during the French and Indian War, where British allied Indians did horrible things to the civilian populace of the American countryside. One particular event that was emblematic of this phenomenon was the Cherry Valley Massacre, wherein Seneca Indians deliberately targeted non-combatants, killing at least 30. Jumping ahead a few decades, nothing has changed. For example, in the village of Pigeon Roost in 1812, Native Americans massacred 24 settlers, including 15 children, without any provocation. At Fort Mims in 1813, the Creek Nation, rather than taking any prisoners when they had defeated the American garrison, instead put all but 36 of the 550 in the fort to the sword, taking some 250 scalps in the process. Though they spared a number of the enslaved blacks, they took more than 100 of them captive for their own purposes. Following their victory, the Indians razed the surrounding plantations, slaughtered over 5,000 head of cattle, destroyed crops and houses, and murdered or stole slaves. During the Scott Massacre of 1817, a vessel commanded by Richard W. Scott, carrying 26 soldiers, 7 women, 4 children, and a guard of 20 armed soldiers, was set upon by Creek Indians. These Creek Indians killed 44, with 6 soldiers and 1 woman escaping. The children on board the vessel were killed by having their heads bashed against the sides of the boat. Scott himself was killed by having splinters of fatwood driven into his body and set afire. This list of events like this could continue on for hours. Now, I'm not saying that every instance of violence that ever occurred between Indians and white settlers was justified on the part of the white settlers. However, if you want to get bogged down in first-hand accounts of horrific atrocities, we can match you shot for shot and then some. The Indians were far and away more savage and brutal. Far more often than not, the Indians were the aggressors and initiators of violence. The great irony here is that the general consensus among people on the left in the modern era is that whites were barbarous brutes who took land from the Indians. It's ironic because we're using the Western, i.e. white, standard of morals and ethics by which to judge historical whites, but not Indians. It seems as though the Indian tribes had no moral compunction about targeting women, children, the sick, the wounded, and the old, and indeed even preferred to do so. Whereas this was not the way of war for the white man. They did everything in their power to avoid the deaths of non-combatants by and large, and events to the contrary are few and far between. Now, you could say to me, well, Jim, these are isolated instances of groups of individuals choosing to do horrific things. This doesn't represent the true character of the Indian tribes as a whole. These events may not have been sanctioned by the leaders of the Indian tribes. Okay, fine, I'll engage with you on those points. Let's take a look at what the Indian tribes decided to do collectively. Let's take a look at the treaties they signed and the wars they waged. The British Empire, in the wake of its defeat in the American Revolutionary War, ceded a large tract of land to the American government with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. No provision was made in the Treaty of Paris for the maintenance of any treaties the British Empire had with Indian nations in that territory. The reason being that that territory was effectively ceded to the Americans by right of conquest. In order to formalize this fact and end or prevent any hostilities with Indian tribes, the United States sought to establish several new treaties. Now, during the American Revolutionary War, the Iroquois Indians were hostile to the Americans. Upon their defeat and the defeat of the British, they fled into Quebec. Now, it's important to note that with the territory in question, the Iroquois themselves had only recently acquired this land from neighboring Indian tribes during the Beaver War. When the Iroquois returned to their former land at the end of the war, they came to find that portions of it had been settled, in the meanwhile, by whites. Naturally, this leads to violence primarily initiated by the Iroquois. This treaty essentially ends hostilities between the U.S. and Indians, requires they submit to U.S. sovereignty, and establishes a border with the Indians who, again, waged war on the American people. The Iroquois sign, but later renege on the treaty and deny that the delegates they had sent had the ability to negotiate in the first place. Due to their penchant for perfidy, several follow-up treaties are necessary. These treaties have much the same result as the first one. With the Treaty of Fort McIntosh in 1785, most tribes who signed it just ignored the treaty. With the Treaty of Fort Finian, also in 1785, the treaty was renounced by Shawnee leaders. With the Treaty of Hopewell in 1786, quote, despite affixing their signatures to the treaties, none of the Native American tribes recognized the sovereignty of the United States over their ancestral lands. In 1789, at the Treaty of Fort Harmar, several nations boycotted the treaty and felt they were not bound to its results. Now, because of this, none of these treaties really had their desired effect. The United States had, in good faith, tried to negotiate with every swinging Richard behind a loincloth, and yielded little for their efforts. After a number of raids and counter-raids, precipitating it, war finally breaks out in 1786, and lasts until 1795. How does the United States treat the Indians when they eventually come out on top and win the war? Do they genocide them? Do they really punish them? No. With the Treaty of Greenville ending the war in 1795, the United States purchases some territory from the Indians, with the Indians receiving annual payments for the land in return. The indigenous groups were, quote, obligated to recognize the United States as the sole sovereign power in the territory, but the local peoples would otherwise have free use of their own lands so long as they were kindly disposed to American settlers. For background, the Iroquois were aligned with the British Empire, and the British Empire had, to a degree, fomented and supported this war. In the 1780s, a war breaks out in the South, the Oconee War, because the Creek Indians refused to adhere to the treaties of Augusta and Galphinton, and a conflict ensues. The Treaty of Fort Adams in 1801 was emblematic of many of the treaties not cited here for the sake of time. The United States negotiates for and pays, in good faith, for the territory they want from the Indian tribes. Regarding this treaty, it was written to President Jefferson that the bounty of the United States was implored, and we were supplicated for materials, tools, implements, and instructors to aid their exertions and to direct their labors. Hope that by the liberal and well-directed attention of the government, these people may be made happy and useful, and that the United States may be saved the pain and expense of expelling or destroying them. Moving on to Tecumseh's War and the Creek War. When the United States, due to its rapidly expanding population, decides that it needs more territory, their MO is to negotiate and purchase said territory, not try to take it by right of conquest. Tecumseh was an Indian leader who was staunchly against further treaty and land cession to white people, claiming that all American soil was held in common by all Indians. Therefore, all Indian tribes must be present and represented in order for any agreement to have the force of law. Tecumseh knew that such, quote, broad consensus was impossible, and that is why he supported the position. He went so far as to threaten to kill those who complied with the Treaty of Fort Wayne in 1809. This treaty is one in which the United States acquired a good chunk of the Ohio Territory through purchase. Again, purchase, not right of conquest. Tensions rose, and by 1812, war broke out, with Tecumseh being the ringleader. So incensed is Tecumseh by negotiation with white people that he also incites the Creeks to war. To preface this, the Creeks too had ceded territory to the Americans through treaty. Tecumseh, who claimed he had supernatural powers sparking a wave of Indian religious revival, created a factional divide among the Creeks between those who supported unprovoked aggression against the whites, the Red Sticks, and the White Sticks who did not support such action. Now, the Creek War begins largely as a civil war, as I said, between the Creeks, but expands to involve the United States in 1813. The U.S. Army intercepted a group of the Red Sticks returning from Spanish Florida with arms they had procured from the Spanish, presumably to be used against American whites, thereby involving the United States. The Red Sticks, in part hoping to murder mixed-race Creek who had taken refuge with the American garrison at Fort Mims, laid siege to the fort and perpetrated what would be known as the Fort Mims Massacre, wherein 400 to 500 people, including women, children, and white settlers, were slaughtered. Now, spoiler alert, both Tecumseh and the Red Sticks did not come out on top. And I don't think it bears going into too much detail on the course of the war and that sort of thing, but I would like to read to you an excerpt from the Treaty of Fort Jackson in 1814, which ended the Creek War. And I want to read it to you because it sums up the key takeaway from these two wars in a much better way than I could ever hope to. Quote, "Whereas an unprovoked, inhuman, and sanguinary war, waged by the hostile Creeks against the United States, hath been repelled, prosecuted, and determined successfully on the part of said states, in conformity with principles of national justice and honorable warfare, and whereas consideration is due to the rectitude of proceeding, dictated by instructions relating to the re-establishment of peace, be it remembered that prior to the conquest of that part of the Creek nation hostile to the United States, numberless aggressions had been committed against the peace, the property, and the lives of the United States, and those of the Creek nation in amity with her, at the mouth of the Duck River, Fort Mims, and elsewhere, contrary to national faith and the regard due to an article of the treaty concluded at New York in the year 1790 between the two nations, that the United States, previously to the perpetration of such outrages, did, in order to ensure future amity and concord between the Creek nation and the said states, in conformity with the stipulations of former treaties, fulfill, with punctuality and good faith, her engagements to the said nation, that more than 2/3 of the whole number of chiefs and warriors of the Creek nation, disregarding the genuine spirit of existing treaties, suffered themselves to be instigated to violence of their national honor, and the respect due to a part of their own nation faithful to the United States and the principles of humanity by impostors, denominating themselves prophets, and by the duplicity and misrepresentation of foreign emissaries whose governments are at war, open or understood, with the United States." To summarize, the Indians time and again are breaking treaties that they themselves agreed to, waging war on the white people of the United States, and forcing the United States to respond violently. Now, with respect to the Treaty of Fort Jackson in particular, This is where many historians begin to malign the United States and Andrew Jackson in particular. They go on to claim that the terms of this treaty were unjustly harsh and punitive. They claim that it's so unfair that the Creeks were forced to cede a chunk of territory. After all, some of the Creeks, the White Sticks, sided with the United States, and now they're getting punished too? But they don't actually like to talk about what the terms of the treaty stipulated. They refuse to provide any context. Here are some of the horrible terms of this treaty. True, Jackson and the United States forces the cession of Creek territory, but only an amount, quote, equivalent for all expenses incurred in prosecuting the war to its termination. That seems like a reasonable thing and has historical precedent. Like, that's a thing nations do. If you're going to force us to go to war with you, you're going to pay for it. You can malign this as a Carthaginian peace, but it's not. Like, full stop. The United States also demands that the Creek stop communicating and trading with the Spanish and British, who kept inciting war amongst the natives for their own purposes. Further, the U.S. demands that all the property and persons taken by the Indians from white people, American citizens, be returned. Now, here's where it really gets interesting. Here's what shows the true character of the United States, of white people, of our magnanimity. Quote, the Creek nation, being reduced to extreme want, and not at present having the means of subsistence, the United States, from motives of humanity, will continue to furnish, gratuitously, the necessaries of life until the crops of corn can be considered competent to yield the nation a supply, and will establish trading houses in the nation at the discretion of the President of the United States, and at such places as he shall direct, to enable the nation, by industry and economy, to procure clothing. Truly the actions of a nation of genocidal thieves, right? So let's talk about the Black Hawk War, which begins in earnest in 1832. It has its origins with the Treaty of St. Louis of 1804. Now, the Treaty of St. Louis is an interesting case, right? It's probably the closest thing to an illegitimate treaty or something unjust done to the Indians that I've come across with respect to U.S.-Indian relations. The story goes that leading up to 1804, in the area surrounding St. Louis, Indians had become increasingly hostile to white settlers. This culminates, as it so often does with the Indians, in the murder and scalping of 4 white settlers. So, the Sauk and Meskwaki tribes, fearing the ire of the United States government for the murder of these whites, sends a delegation of 5 chiefs to negotiate with the whites to make things right. Now, according to Chief Black Hawk, who the war takes its name from, the delegation had been drunk almost the entire time and didn't remember much, but they did remember ceding some land to the United States. The Sauk were incensed because they had not, apparently, given these chiefs the authority to cede land. Furthermore, they had not followed the elaborate Sauk protocol for selling land. They, therefore, claimed the sale was invalid. Now, it does appear from where I sit that, from the Sauk perspective, it really hadn't been a legitimate sale. And I can see their frustration. Like, they sent Shakes the alcoholic clown and his entourage to negotiate with the United States. They get too drunk on firewater and end up selling a good chunk of your territory.
Seriously, Shakes, you drink way too much.
But here's the rub. The fault doesn't lie with white people for that. How are they supposed to know that these chiefs did not have the authority to negotiate with them when they had been sent to negotiate with them? The fault lies with those Indian chiefs who negotiated. Inebriated or not, if they didn't have the authority to sell the land, why did they go ahead and sell the land? And what the hell sort of precedent would it set if we can now backpedal on a treaty and say it doesn't possess the force of law simply because a legitimate delegation of leaders gave more than they were supposed to in a negotiation? Now, the United States, in my opinion, goes above and beyond because at the treaties of Portage de Sioux, taking place at the close of the War of 1812 and the year 1815, the United States government tries to reconcile some of the issues the Indian tribes have relating to not all the proper delegations having been present to sign the treaties. So the United States bends over backwards, signs a bunch of new treaties, essentially reaffirming old treaties that already had the force of law to assuage some of the concerns and soothe some of the hostile emotions coming out of the Indian tribes, even though they don't have to. So everything's copacetic, right? It should all be smooth sailing. The Indians they're all happy. No, wrong. It's never that simple with them. Now, Chief Black Hawk is very much a Tecumseh-like figure insofar as he's a hardliner. He doesn't want to negotiate with white people. He's very mad about the Treaty of St. Louis in 1804. And without getting too bogged down in the irrelevant details of the escalation and subsequent campaign, Chief Black Hawk forms a very prominent war band and goes around with said war band. The U.S. government, convinced that this war band is hostile, though they haven't really taken hostile action just yet, mobilizes a frontier militia, which Chief Black Hawk then eventually attacks, and this kicks off the Black Hawk Wars. Now, I think what's very telling about the legitimacy of some of Black Hawk's claims of injustice at the hands of the white man is the fact that the Sauk themselves were very divided as to whether or not they should support Black Hawk's resistance to these treaties. Now, shitlibs make much ado about the Treaty of St. Louis in 1804, which doesn't seem to be entirely legitimate. Again, not at any fault of the United States government, but bear in mind that these concerns were addressed in 1815 with the Treaty of Portage to Sioux. Now, this is a very small but representative cross-section of the treaties and wars in which the Indians were engaged with white people. So, circling back to the time in which Indian removal is taking place, to this point, there have been centuries of conflicts involving belligerents from all nationalities: the Dutch, the English, the Spanish, the Russians, the French, and of course, the Indians fighting one another. It would be one thing if it were exclusively one nationality, but everybody is coming into conflict with hostile Indians, including the Indians themselves. At some point, you have to ask yourself, is it everybody else who's the problem or the Indians? True, you can flip that argument right on its head and say, well, the English, Spanish, Russians, French, so on and so forth were fighting each other too, but number one, there are key differences in the way they treat with one another and the way they wage war. But number two, nobody is making moral claims that a certain ethnicity or race are evil because the English and the Dutch are fighting each other. To that point, nobody is claiming that the English ethnically cleansed the Spanish and the Dutch and the French because there are no Dutch, Spanish, and French left on the American continent. Furthermore, whites gave more grace to Indians than whites would have ever given to whites. The English never at any point in time considered setting aside a Dutch reservation so that the Dutch people, the Dutch race, the Dutch ethnicity wouldn't disappear from the continent. No, their attitude was, we fought a war, the Dutch lost, the Dutch can assimilate or leave. Get fucked. Whites attempted to negotiate in good faith with the Indians for centuries. They set aside lands for them, they paid for the lands they took, they provided tools and food and provided for education to uplift their society. All this in the face of unabashed hostility. These aren't things you do to a people you want to exterminate. If you wanted them gone, why not simply take the land? People bereft of a sense of morality would have simply taken what they wanted without payment or any regard for the people there, and those people who used to occupy that territory would have been disappeared. They wouldn't exist anymore. They wouldn't be here to complain about it. So, if treating with the Indians doesn't work, purchasing land when you need it doesn't work, and you're constantly getting involved in military altercations with the Indians, what choices do you have in front of you? You really have but two in the face of a superior opponent like white people. You remove them, or you annihilate them. And these shitlibs just don't want to hear it, right? They are convinced that every action white people take is somehow nefarious in nature. And they'll say things to the effect of, adherence to the treaty terms was difficult for both sides. White treaty makers didn't necessarily understand the complexities and fluidity of Indian tribal societies and often overestimated the nature of the authority vested in a particular chief by the band and the preeminence of tribal membership and intertribal alliances and the permanence of Indian settlements and this, that, and the other thing. No, these are nothing more than thin and weak excuses. Excuses used to defend the indefensible behavior of Indians and push your modern day political narrative, which is that white people be bad and shit. So we've seen how the Indians in most instances are overtly hostile when they come into contact with the whites who are pioneering and civilizing the vast wilderness that was the American continent. Westward expansion is not going to stop, nor should it have. Attempts at treating with the Indians fail nearly every time. Attempts to civilize them and incorporate them into Western-style civilized culture failed every time. Whites are far superior technologically and just better outright at waging war. They win every time in the end. This is a conflict of civilizations, and anyone with a modicum of foresight can see that if nothing is done and no action is taken, there can be only one outcome here. There can be only one end result. The complete destruction and elimination of the Indian race. Almost uniquely in history, whites have viewed the complete destruction and erasure of cultures, even inferior cultures, to be a bad thing. So, what options did the whites have? Allow nature to take its course and accept that the fate of the Indian race is complete and utter obliteration? No, they viewed that as unconscionable. Should white Americans have refused to expand and civilize the nation? Undesirable and not in our character or part of our ethos. Should they have quit, completely uproot, and returned to Europe? There would have been no place for them there. That was the whole reason many whites came to the New World to begin with. In any case, by this point in time, by this point in American history, American became an ethnicity in and of itself. The American continent belonged to the white men who pioneered and civilized it by this point, just as much as it belonged to any red man. And if none of these are viable options to you, you have but one left. Place the Indians in such a place where they'll no longer come into conflict with whites. The purpose of a system is what it does. That's to say, to judge the intent and make claims about the morality of Indian removal, you have to take a look at the end result. In the present day, Indian tribes exist. Indian tribes have their own exclusive territory. Indian tribes have a wide degree of latitude with respect to governance, and they're on the whole more prosperous as a result of white people than they would have been otherwise. Fact of the matter is that if Indian removal were a policy of malicious genocide rather than a benevolent policy of preservation, it would have succeeded. The Indians had been soundly defeated on the field of battle time and again, in war after war, and were at the mercy of white people. Whites were technologically superior and far more numerous. Had the U.S. pursued a policy of genocide, the Indians would not be here today to complain about it. Further, if what shitlibs say about white people is true, if the nature and character of whites is such that a vast majority are willing participants or at least complicit in a genocide and ethnic cleansing, why bother to couch it in polite euphemisms such as Indian removal? Why not call it what they intended it to be? Why bother with the notion of removal at all? Why not just wage unrestricted war and line the survivors up in front of an open pit until there are none remaining to oppose you? Now, this video is already nearing an hour long, so I don't want to dive into too many primary documents on the subject of the intent of Indian removal, but there are two documents that I would like to take a look at here, both written by Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson really being the architect of Indian removal. Andrew Jackson writes to the Creek people in 1829, "Friends and brothers, by permission of the Great Spirit above and the voice of the people, I have been made a President of the United States, and now speak to you as your father and friend, and request you to listen. Your warriors have known me long. You know I love my white and red children, and always speak straight, and not with a forked tongue. That I have always told you the truth. I now speak to you as to my children, in the language of truth. Listen. Your bad men have made my heart sicken and bleed by the murder of one of my white children in Georgia. Our peaceful Mother Earth has been stained by the blood of the white man and calls for the punishment of his murderers, whose surrender is now demanded under the solemn obligation of the treaty which your chiefs and warriors in council have agreed to. To prevent the spilling of more blood, you must surrender the murderers and restore the property they have taken. To preserve peace, you must comply with your own treaty. Friends and brothers, listen. Where you are now, you and my white children are too near to each other to live in harmony and peace. Your game is destroyed and many of your people will not work and till the earth. Beyond the great river Mississippi, where a part of your nation has gone, your father has provided a country large enough for all of you, and he advises you to remove to it. There, your white brothers will not trouble you. They will have no claim to the land, and you can live upon it, you and all your children, as long as the grass grows or the water runs, in peace and plenty. It will be yours forever. For the improvements in the country where you live now, and all the stock which you cannot take with you, your father will pay you a fair price. In my talk to you in the Creek Nation many years ago, I told you of this new country where you might be preserved as a great nation, and where your white brothers would not disturb you. In that country, your father, the president, now promises to protect you, to feed you, and to shield you from all encroachment. Where you now live, your white brothers have always claimed the land. The land beyond the Mississippi belongs to the president and to none else. He will give it to you forever. My children, listen. The late murder of one of my children in Georgia shows that you and they are too near to each other. These bad men must now be delivered up and suffer the penalties of the law for the blood they have shed. I have sent my agent and your friend, Colonel Crowell, to demand the surrender of the murderers and to consult with you upon the subject of removing to the land I have provided for you west of the Mississippi, in order that my white and red children may live in peace, and that the land may not be stained with the blood of my children again. I've instructed Colonel Crowell to speak the truth to you, and to assure you that your father, the president, will deal fairly and justly with you, and whilst he feels a father's love for you, he advises your whole nation to go to the place where he can protect and foster you. Should any incline to remain and come under the laws of Alabama, land will be laid off for them and their families in fee. My children, listen. My white children in Alabama have extended their law over your country. If you remain in it, you must be subject to that law. If you remove across the Mississippi, you'll be subject to your own laws and the care of your father, the president. You'll be treated with kindness, and the lands will be yours forever. Friends and brothers, listen. This is a straight and good talk. It is for your nation's good, and your father requests that you to hear his counsel. Signed, Andrew Jackson. Well, perhaps Andrew Jackson was lying to the Indians, right? Perhaps it wasn't straight talk, as he said. Okay, well, let's take a look at how Andrew Jackson addressed the subject with white people. During the 1830s State of the Union address, Andrew Jackson wrote, quote, "Humanity has often wept over the fate of the aborigines of this country, and philanthropy has long busily employed in devising means to avert it. But its progress has never for a moment been arrested, and one by one many powerful tribes disappeared from the earth. To follow to the tomb the last of his race, and to tread on the graves of extinct nations, excite melancholy reflections. But true philanthropy reconciles the mind to these vicissitudes as it does to the extinction of one generation to make room for another. In the monuments and fortresses of an unknown people spread over the extensive regions of the West, we behold the memorials of a once powerful race, which was exterminated or has disappeared to make room for the existing savage tribes. Nor is there anything in this which, upon a comprehensive review of the general interests of the human race, is to be regretted. Philanthropy could not wish to see this continent restored to the conditions in which it was found by our forefathers. What good man would prefer a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms, embellished with all the improvements which art can devise or industry execute, occupied by more than 12 million happy people, and filled with all the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion? The present policy of the government is but a continuation of the same progressive change by a milder process. The tribes which occupied the countries now constituting the eastern states were annihilated or have melted away to make room for the whites. The waves of population and civilization are rolling to the westward, and we now propose to acquire the countries occupied by the red men of the South and West by a fair exchange and at the expense of the United States, to send them to a land where their existence may be prolonged and perhaps made perpetual. Now I ask you, is this the rhetoric of a genocidal man? Are these the sort of speeches that would appeal to a people hell-bent on the genocide and extermination of another people? Much harsher rhetoric in the present day is directed at white people by politicians and the like. and white people have not committed and perpetrated the same savageries and atrocities that the Indians inflicted on whites. Certainly not actively or within living memory. No, there is no light in which you can, with any degree of academic honesty, portray the intentions of the Indian Removal Act as nefarious. Well, Jim, you might ask, if that's the case, then why did some big names such as Henry Clay and Davy Crockett oppose this act? For the sake of time and clarity, I don't want to go too far on that particular tangent, but suffice to say that the debate revolved around the power of the executive office and congressional oversight, combined with some staunch opposition to anything the very caustic and abrasive President Jackson wanted to do. Think Trump derangement syndrome, but in like 1830. The people who generally opposed the Indian Removal Act were usually of the same resolve and opinion as Jackson as to whether it was possible to integrate or peacefully cohabit with the Indians. Again, to draw a parallel in the modern era, think like the Patriot Act. Opposition to the Patriot Act did not make you not a patriot or a traitor somehow. Similarly, opposition to the Indian Removal Act did not make you necessarily opposed to the idea of removing Indians. Truthfully, this is actually an interesting moment in American history to analyze the growth and power and authority of the executive office. And in that light, I am mildly sympathetic to the opponents of the bill, but that's a digression for another time. Okay, so we've established that the intentions of the Indian Removal Act may have been benevolent, but as the saying goes, the path to hell is paved with good intentions. Well, it might qualify it somewhat. If these positive, benevolent intentions led to something horrific and evil, it does not excuse it, and it ought to be condemned. So, functionally, what did Indian removal do? What actually happened? Let's start by examining the text of the Indian Removal Act itself to see what the bill actually provides for. Now, right off the rip here, the subtitle for this act is, quote, an act to provide for an exchange of lands with the Indians residing in any of the states or territories and for their removal west of the river Mississippi. Section 1 of the act gives the president the authority to put together districts of land in the territory west of the Mississippi that the Indians are going to be allowed to occupy if they should treat with the United States and accept the idea of removal. Section 2 gives the president the authority to exchange those districts with the Indians for the land they currently reside on. Section 3 gives the president the authority to assure the Indian tribes that the land west of the Mississippi that they're going to exchange their current land for will be theirs forever unless they become extinct or abandon it. Section 4 of the Act gives the president the authority to have appraisers come through and ascertain the value of any improvements on the land the Indians currently reside on, and to disperse a payment to those Indians for those improvements should they decide to remove themselves west. Section 5 gives the president the authority to give the Indians aid and assistance to enable the Indians to properly remove themselves and for the first year after their removal. Section 6 makes it lawful for the president to promise protection to these Indian tribes. Section 7 says that the president has the same powers and authorities provided to him in this act, both in the territories the Indians currently reside in and in the territories which they may reside in, provided that no existing treaties get broken. And Section 8 provides for a sum of taxpayer money to be provided from the Treasury to pay for this act. And that's it. Refreshingly short compared to modern legislation, I might add. There's no provision in here for the genocide or ethnic cleansing of the United States. There's no provision in here that allows the United States to just straight up steal land from Indians who don't want to leave. All it does is allow the executive office to negotiate with Indian tribes to pay them for their land and get them to go to unoccupied land west of the Mississippi so they stop coming into conflict with white people so that they might survive to see the next century. That is the mandate of Congress. Now, sure, potentially, people in the American government could have simply ignored that mandate from Congress and done whatever it was they felt like doing. So let's take a look at the actual treaties that resulted from this piece of legislation. In 1831, the United States government and the Choctaw Nation signed the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek. Now, what did this treaty do? It agrees that removal will begin in 1831 and be complete by 1833. It states that, quote, each Choctaw head of a family being desirous to remain and become a citizen of the United States shall be permitted to do so. And furthermore, they will be, quote, entitled to a reservation of one section of 640 acres of land to be bounded by sectional lines of survey. The American government agrees to provide, at taxpayer expense, transportation via wagons and steamboats, and ample food, both during the removal process and 12 months after reaching their new homes. Reimbursements are also to be provided for cattle left in the Mississippi Territory. Payment is agreed upon for the land the Choctaws currently hold, and the United States government even agrees to grant an annuity to Choctaw warriors who marched and fought in the Army during the American Revolution and the Northwest Indian War. The treaty also provides for the education of Native Americans and the provision of tools and weaponry and the like. About 15,000 Indians finally agreed to be removed. The remaining 5,000 or 6,000 Choctaws remained. Prominent Choctaw chief George W. Harkins would write of the Indian Removal Act, quote, "It is with considerable diffidence that I attempt to address the American people, knowing and feeling sensibly my incompetency, and believing that your highly and well-improved minds would not be well entertained by the address of a Choctaw. But having determined to emigrate west of the Mississippi River this fall, I have thought proper in bidding you farewell to make a few remarks expressive of my views, and the feelings that actuate me on the subject of our removal. We as Choctaws chose to suffer and be free rather than live under the degrading influence of laws which our voice could not be heard in their formation. The Choctaws chose to leave rather than live under the rule of law and submit to any authority other than their own. Truthfully, I'm a big believer in the right to self-governance, and I can sympathize and empathize with that line of logic and that decision. However, you don't get to blame Whitey for what happens afterwards. The bed was one you made up. Now lie in it. And that's more grace than was ever granted to people like, the Confederacy 30 years later. Turning our eyes to the Chickasaw Nation, we can see much the same treatment was received. With the Treaty of Franklin in 1830, the Chickasaws, after much negotiation, finally agreed to be removed to the west. The preamble to this treaty, written by the Chickasaw chiefs themselves, reads, "The Chickasaw Nation find themselves oppressed in their present situation by being made subject to the laws of the states in which they reside. Being ignorant of the laws of the white man, they cannot understand or obey them. Rather than submit to this great evil, they prefer to seek a home in the West, where they may live and be governed by their own laws. And believing that they can procure for themselves a home in a country suited to their wants and condition, provided they had the means to contract and pay for the same, they have determined to sell their country and hunt a new home. The President has heard the complaints of the Chickasaws, and like them believes they cannot be happy and prosper as a nation in their present situation and condition. And, being desirous to relieve them of the great calamity that seems to await them, if they remain where they are, he has sent his commissioner, General John Coffee, who has met the whole Chickasaw Nation in council, and after mature deliberation, they have entered into the following articles." And, while different in the minutiae itself, this treaty follows much the same form as the earlier one. Just like everything I've talked about today, I'm going to link it if you want to look at it. Now, there are two very interesting things about this treaty. The first being, the Chickasaw Nation ends up netting about $3 million from the sale of their land in the eastern portion of the United States. To put that in perspective, about 30 years earlier with the Louisiana Purchase, the whole of that massive tract of land was purchased for a measly $15 million. They were getting a darn good deal. To better put it in perspective, during the Louisiana Purchase, the United States purchased the land from France for roughly 3 cents an acre. The land purchased from the Chickasaw was purchased at a price of $2.39 an acre, or almost 80 times the amount we paid to France per acre. Now, the second interesting thing is that there was a provision in this treaty for the Indians themselves to go and see the land that had been provided to them in the West before they finally removed there. The Chickasaw, upon seeing said land, was displeased with the quality of the land. So what happened? Were they forced there anyway? No. This treaty virtually ends up getting scrapped, and then they renegotiate with the Treaty of Pontotoc Creek in 1832, and the Chickasaw themselves don't end up truly having to leave until 1837 and 1838. In total, 4,914 Chickasaws and their 1,156 slaves, yes, they owned slaves, ended up moving to the Oklahoma Territory. Similarly, with the Treaty of Payne's Landing, also in 1832, the Seminole tribe of Florida was given 3 years to remove themselves and were paid for the trouble by the terms of this treaty. Now, similar to some of the other treaties we've observed in this video, when the time came for the Indians to be removed, or to remove themselves rather, they reneged on the treaty, claiming that they had been coerced in some way, shape, or form, or that they didn't have all the proper signatories of the treaty, or the people who signed it didn't have the authority to sell the land, and so tensions start rising. The Indian leaders are told that President Jackson intends to force them to comply with the terms of the treaty that they signed and agreed to. Now, I don't feel inclined to recount to you the entire story of the Second Seminole War, but suffice to say, tensions got worse and worse. The Indians end up killing some army private delivering the mail. There's infighting among the Seminoles themselves as to whether or not they should comply with the terms of the treaty, and this whole thing culminates in an event known as the Dade Massacre. So the U.S. Army shows up to oversee the removal of the Indians because, again, the United States government was to provide, at their own expense, for the material condition of the Indians being removed. Mind you, they have no ill intentions towards the Indians. They intend to do them no harm. But anyway, they're set upon by Indians, and 108 of them are slaughtered, beginning the Second Seminole War in earnest. Now, usually when people are talking about the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears, they're referring specifically to the Cherokee and the Treaty of New Echota. In a lot of ways, this treaty isn't much different from the ones we've already covered, but this treaty also is much more beneficial for us to look at because it's a lot longer and a lot more specific and explicit with what the United States intends to do. It gives us much better insight into the intentions of the United States government and how Indian removal actually was to be conducted. And I think this was probably done specifically because there were so many issues with treaties having to do with Indians and Indian removal in the past. For instance, they state that the Cherokee Nation sent a delegation with the full power and authority to conclude a treaty with the United States. It also outlines and commits to paper for posterity that, quote, said commissioners did appoint and notify a general council of the nation to convene at New Echota on the 21st day of December in 1835, and informed them that the commissioners would be prepared to make a treaty with the Cherokee people who should assemble there, and those who did not come, they should conclude gave their assent and sanction to whatever should be transacted at this council, and the people having met in council go according to said notice. To rephrase for clarity, the United States restates its policy, and the Cherokee affix their signature to this document that states absence is tantamount to acquiescence. And that's only reasonable. Skipping over the boilerplate stuff, such as the exact geographical boundaries of the territory and the amount they're going to be paid, which was a considerable sum of $5 million, the United States outlines more specifically how they're going to provide for the Indians on their journey. Article 8 of this treaty stipulates that the United States agrees to, quote, remove the Cherokees to their new homes and to subsist them 1 year after their arrival there, and that a sufficient number of steamboats and baggage wagons shall be furnished to remove them comfortably, and so as not to endanger their health, and that a physician well supplied with medicines shall accompany each detachment of emigrants removed by the government. It also allows that if persons or families believe that they're capable of getting to the new territory by themselves and don't want to be accompanied by the United States government, they'll be allowed to do so. And in lieu of 1 year's provisions, they'll be provided a sum of money to pay for their travel and subsistence if they prefer it. The United States also commits to, quote, invest in some safe and most productive public stocks of the country for the benefit of the whole Cherokee Nation. They allot for a sum of money to be provided to the General Council of the Cherokee Nation to be used as they see fit. They also allot money for orphans and permanent schools. And again, they also allow for heads of families who wish to remain in the territory they currently reside in the eastern United States, to remain if they just agree to abide by the laws of the states in which they reside. They also, again, provide a very reasonable amount of time, 2 whole years, for the Cherokee Nation to prepare to remove, so there would be no issues. These aren't things you do out of malice. These aren't things you do to a people you hate. These aren't the actions of a people hell-bent on genocide or ethnic cleansing. And to claim that they are is an evil, hateful lie. The United States government attempted to negotiate with these people in good faith for centuries. They set aside lands for them and paid them for the lands they took. They provisioned food and tools and provided education to uplift their society. All this in the face of open hostility and a stubborn refusal to adhere to the agreements they signed, which is one of the things they accuse white people of. What are the common themes of all these treaties we've covered? Well, first off, the Indians were, as in pretty much every instance, compensated for the land they were on. When they were not compensated, it was generally land that was seized as compensation for damages incurred during a war, a pretty standard thing for nations to do. They did not have their land stolen from them. They were paid, and we have the receipts. Secondly, in many of these treaties that resulted in Indian removal, they were given the option to stay where they were so long as they would submit to the laws of the territory in which they resided. They openly refused to stop being violent savages. While a little crude, that's not a mischaracterization, and to a degree I can empathize with that. But you can't then go blame the consequences of your actions and your failure to plan and prepare at the feet of whites as some sort of great crime like a genocide or ethnic cleansing. Thirdly, it's not as though white people showed up one day with no negotiation whatsoever, with no compensation, and told them, right now, grab all your things, you have to leave in the dead of night. They were given ample time in their treaties to prepare for the journey, 3 to 5 years in most cases. This is ample time to ensure you're adequately provisioned. This is plenty of time to ensure you are prepared for the elements on the trek. This is plenty of time to scout out and set advance parties to prepare the way, as well as prepare the land itself. Any resulting deaths from exposure or malnutrition are the fault of the Indians for not preparing themselves. You can't lay that at the feet of white people unless your contention is that white people should physically dress and forcibly feed the Indians as though they were invalids with absolutely no agency. As far as disease is concerned, that much is part and parcel of living in an age without modern medicine. The U.S. Army that accompanied the Indians west was subject to the same privations the Indians were, the same elements, the same diseases, and because they prepared, they were okay. And because of the preparations and provisioning from the American government, the vast majority of the Indians who set out on the journey made it just fine. Moreover, as far as the deaths from disease are concerned, those who did not make it, who's to say that these deaths from disease were outside the norm of what might have occurred if they had remained where they were? I'll fully admit that I haven't had the time to research that, and someone should. And I'm pleading ignorance on this count, but you at least have to admit that it's within the realm of possibility that a large percentage of those who died on the Trail of Tears would have died anyway. Fourthly, at no point did the American army brutalize the Indian tribes. The only violence that occurred was in direct response to unprovoked attacks by Indians who did not want to adhere to the treaties that they signed. You cannot use intentional absence from treaty negotiations as a shield from their consequences. Absence is tantamount to acquiescence, and this is the only way treaties would ever be able to be applied anywhere. Further, the corruption of the Indian chiefs who supposedly had been bribed into accepting unfavorable terms is not the problem of whites or the American government. It seems as though Indians should address their corruption issue internally before allowing those corrupt individuals to sign binding treaties with the force of law. It does not and cannot be reasonably expected to render the treaty null, even if there is any veracity to the claims of corruption. Further, just because there are dissenting elements within the tribes that, on the whole, agreed to these treaties, does not mean that those dissenting elements cannot be expected to adhere to them. If that's the standard, how could any negotiation ever take place? That would render each man individually a sovereign in his own right. That's anarchy. That's chaos. If you consider yourself a member of the Indian nation and refuse to subject yourself to American authority, then you must abide by the decisions of the leaders of that Indian nation, though you yourself dissent. That's the nature of civilization and governments, even in cases of rebellion, civil war, and secession. No, in the case of Indian removal, there is scarcely any injustice to be found. In fact, this ought to be lauded as a shining example of white American civility and moral uprightness at their own personal expense. This is an event we all, as heritage Americans, should take pride in. So, with that said, what were the long-term consequences of Indian removal? One of my favorite anecdotes to exemplify the behavior of whites compared to their counterparts of other races and nations when people make slanderous or libelous remarks about their character is that of the Arab-Indian Ocean slave trade. The best estimate for total number of blacks brought out of Africa into the Middle East as slaves is something on the order of 8 to 9 million total. To put that in perspective, the number of slaves shipped directly to North America on the whole is something on the order of 400 to 450,000. Now, I'll grant you that the Muslim Indian Ocean slave trade went on centuries longer. It's of little consequence to the point of trying to make, though. The United States has a black population at present that amounts to about 14% of the total population. Yet, most Arab nations have no sizable black African populations. Why is that? Well, the Arab treatment of slaves was far more brutal than their white counterparts. Most black male slaves in Muslim territories were castrated, and roughly 60% bled to death in the process. Mortality rates of slaves were much higher as a result of their generally much harsher treatment, which is beyond the scope of this anecdote. Well, the Indians aren't slaves, so how is that relevant? My larger point here is that most nations around the globe really don't have a ton in the way of issues with dissident minority groups. Why? Because they killed them all, and they no longer exist to be dissidents. As barbaric as that makes humanity seem, that's the reality of the world. The Indians exist. Their culture is intact, more or less. Without Indian removal, this would not be the case. I could end this video right here with that statement. Indians still exist, therefore whites are less barbaric than everyone else, QED. However, on top of merely allowing Indians to continue existing in their traditional ways, we also grant the Indians special privileges that we do not grant to ourselves. They are provided large tracts of land reserved for them and their culture alone. They have a fair degree of autonomy and are more or less allowed to govern themselves. They are allowed a virtual monopoly on casinos. They are provided exemption from certain types of taxation, so on and so forth. Now, I would love for a similar thing to be done for white people. I would love for, in the wake of demographic change, white reservations to be created. So, dear Indian tribes, you're welcome.